coming. We are going to talk about, obviously, everyone's favorite topic, which is risk management. Who doesn't love to end the day talking about bias testing and model risk management? I'll try not to put you to sleep. We have 25 minutes, so we're going to go relatively quickly. But I want to start off with a quick question. How many of you have formal bias testing in your model development processes? Show of hands. Interesting. How many of you do underwriting? Do we have actual credit people in the house? Yeah. So most people are familiar with doing bias testing on underwriting. As AI approaches us rapidly, what we see is the proliferation of models into spaces that they perhaps didn't live before. And so this becomes much more important. But to kick us off, as I said, I'm joined by Ethan from FICO at the end, Don from Affirm, and Raza from 2OS. And I'd love to hear when you first realized that risk management is important. Ethan, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Brett. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. It's a bit of a beginning, but for me, it really was the great session. It was the subprime on the mortgage crisis. I think that was the first time, again, my career, that the stakes of not adhering to the responsible responsibility really became so big.
Don.
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit of a different answer. So fresh out of college, I was responsible for building this credit and operating model that helped determine, how many loans did a sales agent have to go sell in a particular region. And it was this very sophisticated model, had a lot of these different features and variables in it. And I was like, man, this thing rocks. It's send. Then a few minutes later, I had the sales agent come up to me and said, Don, about the app, there's no way I could sell all these loans. I rated fire for this. And I was just sitting here going, but the model said this was really cool. But I had this person staring me straight in the face about this impact I had created for in this stripe that was there. And that scared the living cat out of me. And kind of that was a pretty emblematic moment of, oh man, these things I do behind this computer are impacting, not just the person in front of me, but hundreds and hundreds of people. They're not used numbers. So that was a pretty big moment. 80% order package again.
Yeah, for me, I think it was when I first saw The Big Short, but that's not why I became a credit risk consultant. So as a consultant, I do, banks usually call us when they have a bunch of these troubles, so I have seen my fair share. I would mention a recent one, which is you all know student loans were delinquencies and everything, or reporting was paused for a while. So more recently, there's a bank, their younger generation losses were going up by 15%, and they had no idea what was happening. It turns out they built the model when the bureaus were not reporting the student delinquencies. And now all of those people look like super low risk, and now when delinquencies are back up, the losses are really high.
I think those are three fantastic examples, taking us from the individual impact that a model can have through to a global impact that bad model risk management can have. And I think it sets us up nicely for our current context. Post-financial crisis, or the framework that we live in today was largely driven by the financial crisis and the reaction to it. So when we think about SR 11.7 and how that has evolved over the last 15 years-ish, is it that long? Good Lord, I'm old. And then how that interacts with the other regulations that we see evolving especially rapidly now. And obviously in the last couple of months, the Fed and the FDIC have significantly changed how they think about that, which we all have to internalize and figure out how we're going to respond to it, where that creates opportunities, and where we want to maintain processes. So Don, Affirm obviously makes a lot of credit decisions. Models are very important to you. You are developing them rapidly. How do you think about bias in those models and where it might show its head?
Yeah, so for me, it's typically, I think about if you're the features that you effectively put in the model. When I think about credit analytics and risk analytics, it's, hey, there's behavior you see that impacts someone's ability to repay. In the build a good model, it comes with think through, what are the features, what are the variables, what are the patterns of behavior that you want to capture that allows you to understand risk appropriately. And so you're sitting there and you're kind of blindly pulling in data and say, people from this region of the country are not paying as they should. I should give them either higher pricing or define them outright. Or, this is a behavior that is new and novel, and I'm going to put it together, and you have burdened the law. And without necessarily thinking through what, customer impact first and foremost, but then obviously you have fair lending concerns, bias, you can run into trouble. So it's almost the first step that we think about model creation for me, that, can impact bias in how you put the constructs, a well-run, well-managed risk governance grid.
For sure. Ethan, your scores probably impact more people than anyone else's scores. Where do you see bias in input data, and how do you address that?
Yeah, I think it's first always important for me to issue the caveat. I'm speaking very much through the lens of the FICO score, which is, one of the, if not the most surpassed predictive analytics in the world. Not only is it used for the planning decisions, surpassed by lenders and regulators, it's monitored by tens of billions of consumers each and every month. There's a PSC release as well, and they're seeing how their behaviors month over month, but your budget, they're finally perfect in a score. And I think with that level of scrutiny, the FAR that they have within the FICO 14 for ensuring that the model is compliant, the model is transparent, the model is explainable, is a very high. I mean, these are all trade-offs. How far am I going to go in this way, and what's it going to cost for resources and hours and fun, and so I think with all that said, one of the things we do at FICO with respect to embedding variables up front, the inputs, if you will, is before we even let the analysts get the data, we meet with the DLT, you meet with the product team, you meet with the compliance team, again through the lens of the FICO score, with oftentimes decent swaps of feature that can sort of be pulled out outright. I remember we were looking at one data source that had identified people by the quality of the university. They're like this within the university with the deciles of quality, and these interesting concepts. And literally, we were interested to study it, and our product team said, "You're not going to deliver these in case like supper. You didn't go good enough."
So I think this is a really important point that, we have 4 quantitative people on the stage. How do you build those relationships with your other stakeholders to make sure that you're kind of understanding these nuances and thinking about them up front?
Well, I think there's a worthwhile investment in bringing along some of those partners that are voluntarily involved in the vetting of their model, either upfront or on backfill, whether that is legal compliance or product. So, me and my team, we take the time to educate a little bit about here's the ways we analyze and quantify the effectiveness of the feature. Here's how we analyze the effectiveness of the overall model, so that we're in a position to have like a conversation where we both speak similar language, so that if there's a somewhat contentious variable, at least the compliance team is in a position to understand that's at stake from a predictive power standpoint, take rewardably the absence would be building in the creator.
Yeah, I think that is a kind of a big lesson that we've all learned, is like make friends with the lawyers first. And I think, especially from Plaid's point of view, where we are dealing with cash flow data, which is still relatively novel, obviously has lots of scope for bias. We think very carefully about how we build variables such that we don't capture anything we shouldn't do, and that we work closely with our compliance teams to put that to its test. I'd love to hear about, actually I'm going to skip that question because we're very tight on time. Obviously, once we've built a model, we've vetted it, we've taken it to the lawyers, we've spoken to compliance, we've made sure up front that each of the variables that we're using is not a proxy for anything that we don't want to account for. We need to go a step further, and we need to think about how the model is performing in the real world. Raza, how do you think about model monitoring, particularly for credit models?
Yeah, so for credit models, like at a minimum, you need to do like monitoring of the data that's going into the model, the data that's coming out of the model, and how the model is doing in all the segments of interest and performance things. But I won't bore you with all the 50 metrics that you need to monitor. I'll make like 2 broader points. One, like oftentimes I've seen team get like really into just like, hey, I'll need to put in all these statistical thresholds. But another thing that oftentimes people miss is you also need to care about the business impact of all of these variables and other things. So make sure you're monitoring that, and that business impact could include like fair lending risk. It could include how much is my like vintage from 2021 in thin files being impacted. Another area that actually AI is really contributing into now is you can use AI to help in monitoring. So initially you don't want to like put in charts and give ChatGPT access to your dashboards. Like it'll do well, but it'll also hallucinate. The place where we are actually seeing it work really well is you actually do agentic AI, where you give AI these tools which are more deterministic, like Shapley values or do drift analysis, and then the agent is just like working on those. And it's like you have a really smart credit analyst who doesn't tire, who's really productive, and just can keep on running different analysis around the clock.
I think that's a really important step forward, where we went from a kind of very prescriptive, I will have a model monitoring plan where I'll look at this every month or every 6 months, to a kind of always-on review. I know, Ethan, part of the kind of impetus for Ultra FICO was kind of FICO responding to things you saw. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, to your point about thin files, I mean, one of the ways we're monitoring is not only on the feature level, understanding how the consistency of the feature is remaining or shifting over time, and the maps talking about distribution of the feature, tying up a risk pattern underlying a feature, streamed one. And Gianni Tying for 2022 is a great example. But we also look at whole model effectiveness, right? How is the model holding up over time? Not just in aggregate, but in specific seconds. And one thing we want to see is that in within credit file segment, a score at the private score based solely on credit bureau data is simply not as powerful as it is in those settings where we had a longer, broader set of credit history. And so that was a large part of motivation for us to look beyond the credit file, but in pilot in particular. And yeah, we're really excited about the recent enough partnership with FICO or about the cash flow data. And FICO is able to spot in combination with the credit tape to really lead to being needed, especially for those tip files. I think it was something there, 50% for prediction in use, which is a big number for us. And we've been at it for 30 years. Definitely, it's a good 50% improvement rate and then more. So we're really...
We're very happy to help with that 15% improvement for sure. Don, I think the type of products that Affirm issues necessarily have a high response rate, a rapid turnover. How do you think about monitoring that over time, and kind of do you think the same way that Ethan spoke about it, or?
I very much try to think of these things as partial to human element. So for when I take the credit monitor, it's definitely culture. We think very heavily about this idea of accountability, redundancy, and subject matter expertise. And so there is simply an expectation that if you're putting something out there, it forwards and backwards, and you're responsible for its performance. And then there are people who are also, out there that want to better understand it as well. I remember someone when my team said, hey, a model went out and boy, it's like 50%.
I got a phone call within 5 minutes from Max Levchin, our CEO, and he was like, what is going on? And someone just forgot to say we went from 7 bips to 10 basis points, which wasn't enough. But it kind of reinforces this idea of look, we always have to be vigilant. We always have to be understanding what we're putting there. While we have these absolutely wonderful new and novel tools that can really help us get better, the people element, the culture behind it, the subject matter expertise is still paramount to making quality risk decisions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You definitely don't want AI reporting to the CEO on your risk metrics. You want to review that first. We talked about the choosing the variables, building the models, monitoring the models. Of course, we don't always approve loans. We often have to deny loans. And in a world of increasingly complicated models, this is a real problem. So, Ethan, I think you probably explained more credit decisions than anyone else on Earth. how do you think about explainability, and how does FICO view the evolution of the modeling framework?
Well, our former CEO, Larry Rosenberger, used to say complexity in development, but simplicity in implementation. I think Blaise Pascal probably said it better when he said, "I'm sorry for writing such a long letter. I didn't have the time to write a short one." And we really force our analysts and everyone in the company to justify adding more complexity to our models. Like, there has to be a really concrete reason why. And as of today, at least, the modeling framework that we ultimately deploy for the FICO score is extremely straightforward. It results in what is essentially a lookup table. Like, here are the 14 variables that we're going to consider for this particular segment. Here's the possible values of those variables. Here's how many FICO score points they get depending on their variable. If you give me a credit report, I can calculate your FICO score in 5 minutes. And if it's that straightforward to calculate your FICO score, it's that straightforward to also calculate what are the key drivers of your score, what are the top 4 reasons or 5 reasons why you didn't score higher. So we continue, again, with the scrutiny that our score gets, to find the trade-off balance to be closer to that. Sacrifice maybe 1 to 2% is what we've seen when we've benchmarked it against some of the most cutting-edge state-of-the-art techniques, although we haven't tried transformer models yet. We're willing to give up that 1 to 2% if in exchange of that we can be absolutely confident in the ways we're explaining these scores back to consumers.
Yeah, Don, I think we're all very excited to hear what Affirm is doing with transformer models. I know it's not quite... in fact, why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. But let's go back to the concept of adverse action notices here for a second. And again, like, you're going to hear me say this, I'm a bit of a broken record, but think about the human element. It stinks to give someone an adverse action notice. It stinks a lot harder to actually receive one. And so, to your point, your ability to explain why you're declining a user and doing that thoughtfully and carefully, does help. It's still a negative experience, but what can be even better is not having to necessarily deliver one in the first place. And so where the use of transformer modeling can really help us is to say, well, we had this traditional GBM model that effectively gave a user a decline. Why don't we run that same data set through a transformer-based model and see if there's something there that we may have missed? So our current use of transformer models are able to look at our decline population and say, hey, here's a user where there's a more complete picture of the story, and we actually feel good about extending them an offer of credit. And so there, we're not necessarily as concerned about how do we necessarily explain it, because we're able to avoid that outcome in the first place and deliver a positive experience to them.
Yeah, I think you said it twice, but thinking about the human element and understanding how a normal human being who doesn't live and breathe credit risk modeling is going to read a set of descriptions, I think is the core to this. And I would hope at some point we have sophisticated explanation techniques that can provide first look explainability for transformer models, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Of course, credit decisioning isn't the only place that we use models in the lending process. We are seeing increasingly broad use of particularly chatbot type models in recommendation engines, in helping consumers understand the products that we're offering them. Raza, how do you think about firstly implementing these models, explaining these models, and also policing these models? If you have a chatbot that ends up always suggesting a particular type of loan to women, is that potentially problematic? Is it something you're seeing in practice?
Yeah, I would say like the technology is not ready for a lot of those like adverse actionable sort of use cases. But in this chatbot case, like there's a lot of things that you can do in terms of monitoring and putting in guardrails. So like just to pick on your example of that women, like you have a chatbot, you can create synthetic personas of like different women names and men names, and it just tests, oh, does the chatbot bias against the woman more or not? So there are a lot of guardrails and testing that you can do. But the biggest bottleneck that it will always come down to is LLM and GenAI explainability. And I think that is going to be the next frontier. Like the analogy I use is think of like GBMs like from 15 years ago. Previously, everyone used logistic regression or statistical models. GBMs came out. people were like, oh no, this is too complex, we can't do adverse action for it, or like this is too complicated. But eventually it started from like sort of like second look, and then sort of getting variables that feed into logistic regression, and then eventually we got to a place where regulators were also comfortable, like, hey, yeah, this is explainable. So we are kind of in the same stage but with transformer models. Like this was a big theme today too. Like transformer models are clearly outperforming your regular models, but like explainability is the biggest bottleneck, and this is an area where like I work on a lot and a lot of people are working on a lot, and it's like an interesting time.
Yeah, for sure. I love the idea that GBM is now the traditional model, that they were all looking on fondly as easy to understand.
Brett, I'm
yeah.
so sorry to interrupt, but actually backstage, Raza made a really interesting point about transformer models that I just wanted to shout out, which was he pointed out that a lot of what the transformer models may be doing, different than GBMs or old model technology, is actually discovering new features. A lot of the work they're doing is not in the optimization of the like weighting of the separation of goods and bads. It's finding better, newer interactions and features. And I just want to call that out because to a certain extent, then that's not really an apples to apples comparison against GBT or some of these other techniques, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah,
I just thought that was...
that's perfectly right. Like if I have just pure traditional credit bureau data, like a transformer would not beat out GBMs by a lot. It's when you have a lot of unstructured data, like Plaid's cash flow data is a really good example. You get a much better understanding of the person's finances, the sequence of transactions. That is just so much more signal that, and the time and everything that GBM cannot capture. Right. But with transformers, you can actually capture those signals and make better credit decisions for the bank and for the customer.
Yeah, I feel this is so much of the story of AI is figuring out how to use it. And actually, this is one application where you're using it for feature engineering that you can then take to another model. I'm still optimistic that we can use a transformer for underwriting, though.
Hopefully.
I think we hit on a lot of things in a short period of time. This is an exciting time to be working in quantitative subjects, and credit is as quantitative as they come. We have all of these new tools. I think the message that I took talking to these guys over the last couple of weeks is you need to take seriously the human element. You need to take seriously the regulation and the process that you put behind these things. And actually, at dinner, Raza said something that was very profound to me, is that like explainability is not just a tick box that you do for compliance reasons. If you can explain a decision better to a consumer, they will have a better experience of what Don pointed out is a very negative event, being turned down for something. And that is good for your brand, it's good for your company, and it might even help that consumer learn something in the future. So thinking of explainability as a first-class citizen, I think is absolutely key to how we develop these more sophisticated models. And I think we actually have a couple of minutes for questions, if anyone has any.
Yeah, hey, well, first, great panel. I appreciate it. I showed up a bit late, so apologies for not being here for the start. But I'm actually very curious about how there's a lot of knowledge in this room and on this panel of risk management within AI models. But when you zoom out and you look at everybody at the company that you're working with, they may not be as aware of how this stuff actually works. And so I'm just curious, how do you guys manage that? How do you communicate effectively to make sure people have enough of an understanding of how this stuff works? And when something breaks, it may not actually be broken. I'm just curious your perspective on it.
Don, I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah. Previously, there was a question on risk management and credit monitoring, and I talked about culture, redundancy, and subject matter expertise. I would, at least for our company, would push back just a little bit. If you are working on these things, there is an expectation that you understand the impact end to end. That's absolutely critical because then it's also your responsibility to bring in your cross-functional partners every step of the way. Going back to Ethan, as he talked about the relationships you build with product, with legal and compliance, this is something that everybody needs to understand because then there's basically, hey, we kind of all have to go into this together. We all have to understand what we're necessarily doing here. And that takes a tremendous amount of work, a tremendous amount of discipline. But that also gives us the right to confidently execute on these plans to understand, hey, if something does break, we're able to identify what the issue is and come up with a resolution in quick order.
I think there was a really interesting point there as well of what if it looks broken and it's not. I used to work for a fairly large personal lender, and we'd launch a new model, and I'd get an email from the CEO, why have our originations dropped off a cliff? And so then kind of knowing that in advance, planning for it, making sure that I had the tools available to show the dashboards of why certain segments moved in the direction they moved in, is kind of important. Rather, I think you made a similar point early on in terms of banking. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I started my career as a data scientist, and at that time it was like, oh, I just need to build the best model. Now my time is mostly spent in like building relationships and talking. So like I'll build a model and then, or an explainability technique, and then it's like, now I have to talk to legal, now I have to talk to compliance. And it's not adversarial, it's always like, okay, try to understand what issues they have, what is the lens they are coming from. They don't care about the math as much, or it would be hard to explain, hey, this Shapley value method, it got a Nobel Prize in economics, so you should just trust it. They are coming from their own lens, like, oh, how would this impact my customers, and these are the 10 laws, how does it satisfy those? So like, I'll just agree with Ethan and Don, like, it takes just a lot from it. And the bigger the organization, the slower it is, and usually it's like the good kind of friction, because you have to spend a lot of time in getting more and more people on board to, like, especially nowadays when you have to do a lot of innovation.
But to your question, I was thinking about that a little bit more. I would imagine there's going to be smaller lenders or organizations with looser risk controls, where someone's going to look at, wow, that model is really powerful. We need to hit, quarterly earnings, or, make our investors happy. Go, go, go. And I do think we'll see that. Hopefully it's well reported on. Hopefully, state, federal regulators crack down on it to make the penalties punitive. But probably fair to expect that will happen.
I would just add, we talk about model explainability. Sometimes explaining the model is not about explaining what's in the model, it's explaining about the factors that are acting on the model outside. So the classic example I think of was we were getting feedback during the Great Recession that, the FICO score's ability to separate risk has totally flattened. The 600s are more or less the same risk as 625s in mortgage. And we just asked people, again, all we have is credit bureau data. We can't really see things like, for example, is it an exotic mortgage or not? When we asked a lender who had that data, can you parse out separately those who were given an exotic mortgage from those who weren't? And it turned out right at that 620 threshold, if you were above that, you could qualify for one of these no income, no job, no assets loans. If you were below that, you got the more traditional loan. All of a sudden, the risk pattern straightened right back up. So I think a lot of explaining these models is about being able to speak to the bigger context shifts in the underwriting, the origination, the marketing of the policy. The more insight you have, the more connections you have to the people who can speak to those aspects of the factors acting on your model, the better you'll be able to explain the model's results.
For sure, and I think this is another place where agents would be pretty good at that kind of thing, kind of scouring the data for what might be causing it, rather than having to deploy a team of data scientists to figure it out. Again, check their work.
Yeah, the agents don't sleep, and you can deploy hundreds of them.
Right, exactly. Great. I think that's about us at the time. Thank you very much.